To expect the same service from raw and undisciplined recruits as from veteran soldiers is to expect what never did and perhaps never will happen. Men who are familiarized to danger meet it without shrinking, whereas troops unused to service often apprehend danger where no danger is.
In the years of the American Revolution, General George Washington's Continental Army fights bravely and indeed valiantly for independence from Great Britain. But for all their fighting spirit, with the loss of New York City in 1776 and Philadelphia the following year, it soon becomes clear that a crucial piece is missing from the Patriots' battlefront. When Washington sees the power and mobility of horse-mounted soldiers and officers, he is merely reminded of tactics that have, to that point, been employed for centuries. Indeed, the shock and awe of the mobile, armored troop continues to be utilized on the battlefield, even today, as the horse is gradually replaced by the automobile, the tank, and defense aircraft. While cavalry and dragoons have been in use in Europe and Asia for hundreds of years, it is the American Revolution that serves as the birthplace and the start of an evolutionary journey for the United States Cavalry.
Cavalry, a four-footed blitzkrieg, fast-moving, hard-hitting. The idea then was get the fastest means available of moving over varied terrain and build a fighting unit around that mobility. Times change, but today the idea is exactly the same. Only now the cavalry moves on the wind, and the saddle trooper has become the sky trooper. Air Mobile is the military word for such a unit, and the Army's first such combat division is now in being. The 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. The new first team.
Around 350 BC, the Greek historian, soldier, and mercenary Xenophon writes perhaps some of the earliest works detailing the command of cavalry and the use and care of horses. Born in Athens, but identifying with Sparta for most of his life, Xenophon is a student of Socrates and spends a great deal of time fighting with mercenaries led by Cyrus against the Persians. His account of the battles, like the Battle of Cunaxa that saw Cyrus perish on the battlefield, and the journey home, forms the foundation of his history, Anabasis. Xenophon also went on to write a comprehensive, if not romantic, biography of Cyrus the Great himself, the Cyropedia. His work, the Hellenica, is a source many historians refer to as the most accurate account of the years in Greece from 411 to 362 BC, continuing the history begun by Thucydides in that author's History of the Peloponnesian War. One of few authors from his time period whose entire body of work was preserved intact, Xenophon's writing covers a number of topics and genres, including histories, biographies, Socratic dialogues and apologies, and most importantly, manuals for the hunter, soldier, and horseman. Xenophon draws on his experiences as a soldier and cavalryman in his work Hipparchus, or the duties of a cavalry commander.
First of all, it is incumbent on you to offer sacrifice and to entreat the gods to grant you to think and say and do those things by which you may exercise your command most agreeably to them, and with the greatest pleasure and honor and benefit to yourself, your friends, and your country. When the gods are propitiated, you must prepare your cavalry, taking care that the number prescribed by law may be completed, and that the force previously enrolled may not be diminished. For unless new horsemen are added, the number will constantly grow less, as some must retire from old age, and some must fail from other causes. After the complement is made up, you must take care that the horses may be fed in such a way as to be able to endure exertion. For horses that are too weak for their work will be unable either to overtake an enemy or to retreat. You must make it an object of your attention, too, that they may be fit for service, for such as are unmanageable are an aid to the enemy rather than to their friends. Such as kick when they are mounted also must be set aside, for they often inflict more mischief on their own side than the enemy inflict. You must pay attention to their feet also, that they may be in a condition to be ridden even on rough ground, knowing that when they suffer from being ridden, they become useless. When you have your horses in proper condition, you must next exercise your men. In the first place, that they may be well able to vault on their horses, for by that means safety has been secured by many. And in the second, that they may be qualified to ride over every kind of ground, as the enemy will be at different times in different places. When they are able to sit firm, you must see that they exercise themselves as much as possible in throwing javelins on horseback, and that they qualify themselves to do everything that cavalry ought to do.
In that same year, 350 BC, Xenophon sets down his rules of horsemanship and essentials for the soldier on horseback in his short treatise on horsemanship.
I wish also to set down how the man who is to run the hazard of battle on horseback should be armed. To begin with the cuirass, this must always be made to fit the body, for if it fits well, the body supports its weight. But if it is very loose, the shoulders have to carry it all by themselves. As for too tight a cuirass, it is a straitjacket, and not a piece of armor. For a helmet, the Boeotian is the best, in my opinion, since it most completely protects all the parts that are above the cuirass, without preventing you from seeing. Now, as the rider himself is in extreme danger if anything happens to his horse, the animal also should be armed with a frontlet, breastplate, and thigh pieces. The last serve at the same time to cover the thighs of the rider. For offensive, I recommend the saber rather than the sword. For the rider being aloft, a scimitar blow will be more in place than the thrust of a sword. Instead of a spear of scantling, which is weak and clumsy to carry, I am inclined to recommend 2 javelins made of cornel wood. A skillful person can throw one and then use the other in front, on the flank, or in the rear. They are also stronger than the spear and handier to carry.
Throughout the ages, many cultures make use of horses in warfare. Early nomadic Central Asian peoples utilized cavalry in constant conflict among the many other tribes in their area, most famously in the Mongol conquest over most of the Eurasian continent. Muslim warriors in North Africa, Asia, and Europe during the 7th and 8th centuries also make use of light cavalry in their campaigns throughout those regions. The Middle Ages saw European knights become the ultimate heavy cavalry, as armored men and their sometimes armored horses ride into battle as England, France, Germany, Spain, and other countries fight over territory, and later as the Roman Catholic Church mounts the Crusades from about AD 1096 through 1291. Long after the Crusades, conflict over territory continues, as United States Cavalryman Lieutenant Colonel George T. Dennison writes in his 1868 book, Modern Cavalry, in which he gives a brief history of cavalry in 1500s Europe.
Prince Alexander of Parma, when in 1552 he wished to surprise the Duke of Alençon, mounted several companies of infantry on pack horses, and thus hastened towards the enemy. This was the first instance of the employment of that force, and shortly afterwards it became customary to mount large bodies of infantry in order to move them quickly upon the decisive points, until at length dragoons came to form a portion of every army. Now that firearms are so much more deadly than heretofore, so much the greater advantage will be derived from the employment of mounted men trained to fight on foot with these new weapons.
It would be the combined strength of firepower, manpower, and horsepower that would lead to victory for a country of rebels over 200 years later.
The time is now near at hand, which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves, whether they are to have any property they can call their own, whether their houses and farms are to be pillaged and destroyed, and themselves consigned to a state of wretchedness from which no human efforts will deliver them. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage and conduct of this army. Our cruel and unrelenting enemy leaves us only the choice of brave resistance or the most abject submission. We have, therefore, to resolve to conquer or die.
On April 14th, 1775, General Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in North America, receives instructions to disarm and arrest American revolutionaries, their leaders, and militiamen. Just 2 months previous, Britain had declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion. Commanding British regulars from Boston, Gage sends 700 soldiers to Concord in an effort to seize the stockpiled ammunition and weapons from the colonial militia. This is the night of April 18th, 1775, which will be made famous by the ride of Paul Revere. Revere and other men on horseback race across the Massachusetts countryside through the night, warning citizens and militia alike of the impending British attack. As the morning of April 19th comes, 77 Minutemen attempt to defend Concord's village green from the British, but their ranks are thin, and the British, killing several Minutemen, move through this initial line into Concord proper. There, the British find a force of 500 Minutemen and are forced to retreat to Boston. The road back to their base of operations is fraught with volley fire at every turn, as the British are attacked by thousands of militiamen from various villages along the route. The message to both sides was clear. The war was on. In the first year of the American Revolution, the colonials fight bravely, using tactics wholly unfamiliar to the British redcoats, and making the most of their intricate knowledge of the land they had come to call their home. However, by the following year, it becomes apparent to General Washington that resources and tactics have provided Britain with a certain edge on the battlefield. While there were a few mounted regiments, they were not nearly enough to match forces with the British Dragoons. In their History of the Armor Cavalry, published in 1969, Mary Lee Stubbs and Stanley Russell Connor encapsulate the evolution of the United States Cavalry that began with the American Revolution. At the time of the American Revolution, the term cavalry was applied to that branch of the military service whose members served and fought on horseback. The word horse was used about as often and meant essentially the same thing. By the 18th century, specialization had developed sufficiently in cavalry to bring forth 3 distinctive types of mounted commands, varying in mission, armament, and weight of horses. The heavy cavalry, used primarily for shock effect in battle. The light cavalry, designed for reconnaissance, screening missions, and messenger service. And the dragoons, trained to fight both on foot and on horseback. In actual practice, these distinctions were far from precise, and they tended to decrease in importance in the 19th century. In North America, the traditional cavalryman has ever been the light dragoon, a soldier trained and equipped to fight mounted or dismounted, to perform screening and reconnaissance, and to act as a scout or a messenger. Never was the need for a skilled cavalry more apparent than at the Battle of White Plains on October 18, 1776. After British General William Howe is driven from Boston in March, Howe and his men set up a base in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and set their sights on capturing colonist-controlled New York City. After intelligence-gathering missions have confirmed to Washington that British troops have begun taking positions throughout what is now New York State and the Hudson River Valley, the general is sure that Howe and his redcoats are planning an attack on White Plains, home to a Continental Army supply depot. Washington immediately orders reinforcements, but they wouldn't be enough to save White Plains or New York City.
General Washington selected a position near White Plains, fortified by 2 lines of entrenchments, and there awaited Howe's attack. The trenches were on slightly rising ground, the left protected by swampy ground and the right resting on the Bronx River. Beyond the right was a piece of high ground called Chatterton's Hill, which commanded the plain over which Howe would have to advance. It was occupied by Hazlitt's Delaware Regiment, with 2 guns of Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery, and supported by McDougall's brigade, in all about 1,600 men.
Although Howe outnumbered Washington, he deemed it unwise to attack the main position until he had gained possession of Chatterton's Hill. He therefore sent Leslie with his own brigade and 3 regiments of Hessians, about 4,000 men in all, to dislodge Hazlitt. They forded the Bronx and advanced up the hill, their attack preceded by a sharp artillery fire from 13 guns posted on the east side of the Bronx River. Such effective resistance was made by 2 excellent regiments in McDougall's brigade and by Hamilton's 2 guns that the first attack failed. Later, it was renewed in front, while Rail, with one of his Hessian regiments, made his way around Hazlitt's right flank, and this attack succeeded. McDougall retreated, bringing off the guns and joining Washington's main position. The chief object of Howe's maneuver, to get in rear of Washington, and by occupying a line from Long Island Sound to the Hudson to surround him and cut off his communications with New England, had thus failed. He had, nevertheless, succeeded in dividing Washington's small force into 3 bodies, one in New Jersey, at or near Fort Lee, one on Manhattan Island, at or near Fort Washington, and the 3rd at North Castle. The main body at North Castle and the most important post at Fort Washington were 25 miles apart, and Howe was between them. In December of 1776, the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons are commissioned by the Continental Army. The regiment, nicknamed Sheldon's Horse, after Colonel Elisha Sheldon, who initially commands the militiamen from which the Dragoons are formed, consisted of 6 units, 2 companies of light cavalry, and 5 troops from Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. A major in the Light Dragoons, Benjamin Talmadge, will later become Washington's chief intelligence officer and organizer of the famous Culper spy ring, providing reconnaissance of British actions in New York. The Light Dragoons soon become known as Washington's Eyes, and through their efforts on the battlefield and their espionage, they proved to Washington, as well as the Continental Congress, the usefulness of a more intensive unit of mounted officers and infantrymen. On the 14th of March, 1777, Congress approved Washington's regimental organization for the Light Dragoons. It provided 3 field officers, a staff, and 6 troops for each regiment. Each troop contained 3 officers, 6 non-commissioned officers, a trumpeter, and 34 privates. One of the sergeants specialized in logistics, and 2 privates, an armorer and a farrier, received higher pay. The farrier provided rudimentary veterinary care and shod the horses. The staff was similar to an infantry regiment's, with the addition of a riding instructor and a saddler to keep leather gear in repair. 4 supernumeraries were cadets, undergoing training, who served the colonel as messengers. The Continental Light Dragoon Regiment was comparable to the British version, but it provided more specialists on both the troop and regimental level to allow greater dispersion on reconnaissance missions. The problems involved in procuring the horses and the special cavalry weapons and equipment, in training the horses for combat, and in developing high standards of individual skill contributed to the long periods needed to organize these regiments. While the Act of Congress was a step forward in winning the war, the challenges faced by the formation of the new units proved daunting. To assist in recruiting and training the new dragoons, the United States turns to Count Casimir Pulaski, a Polish soldier who had by that point led successful campaigns in Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Recommended by Benjamin Franklin, who urged Washington to accept Pulaski into the volunteer army, Pulaski traveled to America in the summer of 1777. It would be several months before Pulaski would receive his rank, but on September 11th, 1777, before Congress approved his admission into the Continental Army, Pulaski and Washington successfully fought off British troops at the Battle of Brandywine. The quick tactical work and leadership of Pulaski not only prevented a calamitous Continental defeat, but saved Washington's life. With his reputation among Americans secured, Washington makes Pulaski a brigadier general only 4 days later, and in the winter of 1777 through 1778, Pulaski trains the new corps of Continental Light Dragoons at Trenton, New Jersey. Friction between Pulaski and some American officers leads to Pulaski's resignation of that post, but in 1778, Pulaski is authorized to form his own corps, and the training and discipline imparted to the Light Dragoons have affirmed many historians' assertion that Pulaski is the father of the American cavalry. The Dragoons fight bravely in dozens of skirmishes throughout the American Revolution, but perhaps the most notable was the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina on January 17, 1781. The Continental soldiers, led by Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, with support from Colonel William Washington's 1st and 3rd Continental Light Dragoons, successfully defeat the British in a battle that sees the infantry making use of the hilly terrain as cover for musket volleys, as the Dragoons provided cover as the soldiers changed positions. The Battle of Cowpens ultimately becomes the linchpin in the American effort to retake South Carolina from the British. During the late 3rd century AD, the Christian martyr St. George is born to Greek parents, whose Greek name was originally Georgios, or worker of the land. Both his father, Gerontios, and his mother, Polychronia, were of noble Christian families and raised their son with those beliefs. After the death of his parents, George applied to Emperor Diocletian for a position in the Roman army. Diocletian had known George's father, who had also been a soldier, and the emperor gladly welcomed the son of Gerontius into the ranks. Soon, George was a high-ranking officer, a part of Diocletian's imperial guard. In February of AD 303, Diocletian issues an edict demanding that all Christian soldiers be arrested. George objects, declaring himself a follower of Jesus Christ, and despite Diocletian's attempts to convert George with offerings of land and gold, George continually refused. This left Diocletian no choice but to execute George for his refusal. George gives all his money to the poor and prepares himself for his torture and execution. Not long after his grueling punishment and his beheading, George's body was returned to Lydda in Palestine for his burial, and Christians began to spread word of his martyrdom. For his bravery in the face of persecution, George was named a saint in Catholic, Anglican, and Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches. He is a patron saint in numerous countries, and his willingness to fight for what he believes in made him a perfect patron saint of the United States Cavalry. In addition to his martyrdom, St. George is also immortalized in a legend in which George does battle with a ferocious dragon and rescues a damsel in distress.
When the valiant knight perceived that his enemy was about to fly from him, he sprang fiercely, like an enraged lion, upon his prey, and boldly placed his sword across the mouth of the den. This act angered the monster, and she began to bray horribly, and turning about her speckled tail, armed with poisoned darts, she threatened to sting him. But he was not dismayed, and with his mighty arm he struck her a violent blow, which glanced from her head to her shoulder. It made her dizzy for a moment, and enkindled within her a tenfold rage. And gathering herself up into a posture for leaping, she sprang high, and winding her enormous tail about her, fell with fierce power upon the shield of our knight, whose body she instantaneously enfolded in her fearful instrument of mischief. God help the man thus wrapped in error's endless train.
While the American Revolution and the War of 1812 see dragoons and cavalry becoming integral forces in the defense of the United States, it is not until 1838 that the Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania becomes the Cavalry School of Practice. In a program started from scratch, Commander Edwin Sumner was charged with training and recruiting new mounted cavalrymen. A cavalry drill manual from 1891 lays out the overall goals and operations of the school.
This school has for its object the instruction of the individual recruit, on foot and afterward that of the squad. From the beginning, the instructor will insist upon a smart appearance of the recruits and will exact that their clothing be clean and neatly adjusted. The instructor explains each movement in as few words as possible, at the same time executing it himself. He requires the recruits to take by themselves the proper position and does not touch them for the purpose of correcting them, except when they are unable to correct themselves. He avoids keeping them too long at the same movement, although each should be understood before passing to another. He exacts by degrees the desired precision and uniformity.
The school is a success, and the United States government commissions 2 more cavalry schools throughout the 1880s, one at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and another at Fort Riley, Kansas. The cavalry schools operated at Forts Riley and Leavenworth under various names until October of 1946. By then, new technologies, namely tanks, automobiles, and planes, led the United States Army to suspend all training and programs that instructed mounted troops. But in 1839 in Carlisle, Captain Samuel Ringgold would train his recruits in the use of flying artillery, which married field artillery with mounted units, and would rise to fame and even legend 7 years later during the Mexican-American War.
On the 24th of April, General Arista assumed the chief command of the Army of Mexico. On the same day, General Taylor detached a party of 63 dragoons to watch the course of the river above Matamoros. This party, under the command of Captain Thornton, were watched by the Mexicans, and at a point about 30 miles from the American camp were surprised and attacked. After the loss of 16 men killed and wounded, they were compelled to surrender to the superior forces of the Mexicans, who in large number had surrounded them in a fenced plantation field. This was the first actual fight of the war, and was received by the Mexicans as an augury favorable, but fallacious in the events which followed to their success. General Arista, desirous of making a favorable impression, treated his prisoners with distinguished respect and kindness.
In the battle that led President James K. Polk to ask Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico, the Dragoons' defeat seems an inauspicious debut for the force during what becomes known as the Mexican-American War. However, the following month sees Lieutenant Charles May, under the command of General Zachary Taylor, leading the company of 2nd Dragoons in the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, once more against General Arista and the Mexican Army. In a retreat after the American victory at the Battle of Palo Alto, Arista moves his forces to a more secure position along a riverbed near the Rio Grande. General Taylor tasks Lieutenant May and his dragoons with clearing the Mexican battery, and the mounted soldiers overtake the battery and more, capturing Mexican General Romulo Diaz de la Vega and sending Arista and the rest of the Mexican army into a retreat. The battle results in the capture of many Mexican Army artillery pieces. It solidified the fighting reputation of the 2nd Dragoons, and it gives the United States Army a decisive win that would bolster confidence and ensure American victory over Mexico 2 years later, completing the goals set by President James K. Polk of annexation and territorial expansion in the Southwest.
St. Louis, Missouri, December 17, 1860. Sir, I have today received a letter from Major Hunter, acceding gladly to my proposal to him to accompany you to Washington. We are old officers and old friends, and if any difficulty should arise, which is barely possible, I should hope we might be of some service to you. I am reading everything I can find on the events of the day, and the more I study them, the more I am convinced that secession is treason, not in a state collectively, but in the individuals of a state who contravene the laws of the United States, and who cannot be absolved from the obligation to obey those laws by any state authority. I do not believe it would be necessary for the general government to make war upon the seceding states. The collection of the revenues and the holding of the forts, which would be indispensably necessary, would be to some extent coercion, but still they would be defensive measures. And I think the people of the South will pause some time before they will go to war with the general government. Has it occurred to you, sir, that the white males of the Cotton States are only about 1/10 of the white males of the whole country? What would posterity think of us as a people if we should let this 1/10 break up our glorious government? It is evident that affairs are becoming more and more complicated every day, but the greater the difficulties, the greater the glory in overcoming them. Will you please let me know when you will leave for Washington? And in the meantime, if I can be of any service to you, I beg you to command me. With highest respect, your obedient servant, E.V. Sumner, Colonel, USA.
Edwin V. Sumner, who had spent much of his career training, recruiting, and commanding cavalrymen, was appointed senior officer to accompany President-elect Abraham Lincoln from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. in March of 1861, on his way to assume his role as Commander-in-Chief. The United States Cavalry sees a shift in its duties during the American Civil War. While the mounted soldiers still see offensive action, duties of the cavalry now include reconnaissance missions, hearkening back to the 2nd Light Dragoons of the Revolution. Defensive actions meant to delay the onslaught of enemy forces, pursuit and harassment of defeated and retreating enemy forces, and long-distance raiding to capture enemy communications, supplies, and railroads. Organizations and designations are also shifted in a move that sees 4 types of mounted forces mobilized: cavalry, which fights mainly on horseback; mounted infantry, which moves on horseback but fights on foot; dragoons, a combination of light cavalry and infantry who fight both mounted and on foot; and the irregulars, soldiers for hire employed by both the Union and the Confederacy, with no standardization of weaponry or tactics, who would become more famous in their campaigns fighting on the side of the South. While dragoons were present leading up to and during the Civil War, the 2 official corps dragoons left in operation at the outbreak of the war were redesignated, the 1st and 2nd Cavalry. Prior to the war, the 1st and 2nd Dragoons had seen combat during the War of 1812 at the Battle of Lundy's Lane and the siege at Fort Meigs. The combined regiment of light dragoons had been dissolved 3 years after that war in 1815, but they were called upon to fight again during the Mexican-American War and during the violence that erupted between pro- and anti-slavery belligerents in Kansas and Missouri in the years leading up to the Civil War, in what came to be known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1861, the Union Army soon sees the need of a mounted strike force, and the 1st and 2nd Dragoons, now the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, become an integral part of the Army of the Potomac, mostly serving as reserve and backup defense, serving, among other places, at the Battle of Gettysburg. In addition to the rigorous training, skill, and speed required of the cavalrymen, a key component to the mounted soldiers' victory on the battlefield are the weapons they use. By the Civil War, muskets and rifles were still in use, but technological advances had equipped the soldier with the revolver as well. In the 1868 book Modern Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel George Dennison, Jr., collects his own experience with cavalry munitions, as well as musings from General Stephen Lee and Colonel Harris von Bork on the tools that cavalry carry into the battlefield. We will consider here the different arms which have been in use in mounted forces and the comparative advantages and disadvantages connected with each, taking into consideration the sword, the lance, the carbine, the pistol.
Nearly all the cavalry used by the Confederate States, and in fact by both sides, was nothing more than mounted riflemen. The saber was done away with by the Confederate States Cavalry pretty well, and rarely used in action by either party, and in my opinion has lost much of its merit since the revolver has been brought to such perfection. The sword is a good weapon though, but little used during the recent war.
One of these encounters, an affair of a few minutes, was with a newly organized regiment of Federal Lancers. They stood 300 yards from us in the line of battle, and presented with their glittering lances, from the point of each of which fluttered a red and white pennon, and their fresh, well-fitting blue uniforms turned up with yellow, a fine martial appearance. One of our regiments was immediately ordered to attack them, but before our Virginian horsemen got within 50 yards of their line, this magnificent regiment, which had doubtless excited the liveliest admiration in the northern cities on its way to the seat of war, turned tail and fled in disorder, strewing the whole line of their retreat with their picturesque but inconvenient arms. I do not believe that out of the whole body of 700 men, more than 20 retained their lances, and their sudden and total discomfiture furnished a striking proof of the fact that this weapon, formidable enough in the hand of one accustomed to wield it, is a downright absurdity and encumbrance to the inexperienced.
Lomax had 3 brigades of Virginia cavalry armed principally with Enfield rifles, and these useless things for mounted men had nearly ruined the whole command. I'd rather command a regiment armed with good oaken clubs.
If the men are critical of the weaponry thus far, they save their praise solely for the pistol, perhaps the most practical firearm for use on horseback, particularly while in motion. As Colonel Gilmore continues,
I saw the lieutenant run down under the riverbank, and several throw up their hands in token of surrender. But just as I thought all had given up, a sergeant mounted his horse and dashed at me, calling out to the men to follow him. "There are only 5 men," said he. "Don't surrender to 5 men." Kemp had his revolver out and killed the brave fellow before he came within reach of my saber. But the rest had taken courage and began to mount and come at us, with balls whistling around their heads. Had I drawn my pistols instead of saber, several would have fallen, for we were at close quarters.
as the cavalry continues its evolution, we will see technology throughout the ages advancing beyond the saber, the Enfield, and even the horse. Each generation of cavalry continues a proud tradition while employing and embracing technological change. From the ancient Greeks to the dawn of the American Civil War, we see the dragoon and the cavalryman only begin to assert their place in history, and the United States Cavalry become a force to be reckoned with. As the conflicts, technologies, and attitudes change throughout the years, we shall come to see the cavalry become a crucial element of the United States Army. Perhaps the most iconic image of the United States cavalrymen is one of the mounted soldiers of the Old West, as noted law and military men like George Armstrong Custer, Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, and future President Theodore Roosevelt lead cavalrymen on the battlefields of the western frontier and Mexico. Another future notable figure and cavalryman who serves during the Pancho Villa expedition is George S. Patton. He is soon to be known as the fightingest general of World War II, and he had this to say about his time with the cavalry and the army.
Wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and of the man who leads that gains the victory.
Soon, we will meet the legendary figures that have captured the American imagination and further solidify the reputation of the United States Cavalry.
So a radical concept in military organization has proven itself. It is an important step in a world where the speed with which a fighting force can react in the field can be the deciding factor in victory. The new Air Mobile Division is not a replacement for its heavier infantry counterpart, but it is, like the old cavalry, a fast, hard-hitting doer of special jobs. A new, agile, important addition to the versatile combat capability of the United States Army. The 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. The new first team.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.